The Carter family hadn't planned on buying a Christmas tree that night. They were just driving home from the boys' basketball practice when they saw it. An enormous spruce leaning against a lonely roadside stand, its needles glistening under the parking lot lights like wet glass. No other trees were displayed, no customers browsing, no string lights or music. Just that one tree and one silent man. He stood stiffly beside it, bundled in a faded coat that looked older than the town itself. His face was half hidden beneath the brim of his cap, and when Mr. Carter asked the price, the man simply raised one finger. $1? Mrs. Carter whispered, startled. A slow nod. No smile. No explanation. They exchanged uncertain glances, but the kids were already begging. It was huge, beautiful, easily the kind of tree that usually cost a small fortune. So they paid the single crumpled bill and tied the spruce to the roof. When they turned back to ask about twine, the man had stepped away, farther than a person should have been able to move in a few seconds. He stood at the shadowy edge of the lot now, watching them with an unreadable stillness. At home, the kids joked that it smelled like the woods and old secrets, but the family laughed it off. They strung lights, hung ornaments, and admired the way the branches seemed to almost lean forward, as if eager to be decorated. But sometime around midnight, Mrs. Carter woke to a delicate metallic clatter. She assumed the cat had gotten too curious and shuffled toward the living room. The cat was asleep on the couch. The ornaments, however, were scattered across the floor, some rolled into corners, some cracked, some lying directly beneath the tree as if they'd been yanked off. The branches swayed gently, though no window was open, no heater running. She blamed gravity, faulty hooks, anything that made sense. She gathered everything up and went back to bed. What she didn't notice, what nobody noticed, was that one of the lower branches, once thin and needle-covered, now bent strangely at the tip, forming something like a joint, something like a knuckle. And as the house settled into sleep again, the tree settled too, its branches curling inward, then outward, almost like a slow, practiced stretch. Its first night in the Carter home had gone well. It was only beginning. By morning, the Carters had settled on blaming loose hooks and a shaky stand. It was easier than considering anything stranger. But over breakfast, the kids pushed their cereal bowls aside with pale, sleepy faces. "Mom," 8-year-old Beth said quietly, "the tree was talking last night." Her brother, Sam, nodded too quickly, like he'd been waiting for someone else to say it first. "It said a name over and over, something like Leon or Leanne. I don't know, but it kept whispering." Mrs. Carter froze mid-sip. "Sweetheart, trees don't whisper." "But it sounded like someone trying to remember, like the tree was practicing a name." Mr. Carter tried to laugh it off, but it came out thin and nervous. "New houses make noises. Even trees dry out and crack." But the tree wasn't cracking. It wasn't drying. If anything, it looked fuller than the day before. That evening they decorated it again, more carefully this time, double securing each ornament. Yet hours later, long after the kids had gone to bed, another faint metallic tap echoed down the hallway. Mrs. Carter insisted on checking the tree again, dragging her husband with her. The ornaments they'd hung so neatly were scattered once more, but this time not randomly. They lay in a curved pattern on the carpet, a crescent shape pointing straight toward the hallway that led to the children's rooms. "What kind of pattern is that?" she whispered. Mr. Carter bent closer, frowning. The spruce's lowest branches hung lower than they had that morning, heavy and swollen, as though the wood itself had thickened. Then they both saw it. One of the branches twitched. Not a sway, not a shift, a twitch, quick and sharp, like a reflex. They stepped back at the same time. "It's from the air vents," he muttered, though the vents were off for the night. Mrs. Carter's stomach knotted. She glanced toward the children's rooms. "What if we move it outside?" "For what? So the neighbors can laugh at us for being scared of a tree?" He tried smiling, but his eyes didn't match. They went to bed pretending the world was still normal. But neither slept well, because sometime after 3 a.m., a sound drifted down the hallway, so soft it could have been imagination. A whisper, slow, searching. "Le? Leanne?" And from the living room, a faint creaking, wood bending, stretching, like something practicing how to move. Something getting better at it. By the third night, the house felt wrong. Not in any dramatic way. No banging on walls, no flickering lights. It was subtler than that, like the air itself had thickened, like the hallways had grown a little narrower. The Carters didn't say it out loud, but every one of them felt it. That evening, when Mr. Carter went to water the spruce, he stopped cold. The branches weren't just fuller now. They were longer. A lower bough he could easily walk under the day before was now close enough to brush his shoulder. Another hung low enough that the cat refused to walk past it, choosing instead to circle the couch and sprint out of the room with its back arched. Maybe it absorbs moisture strangely," he said, though the explanation made no sense even to him. Mrs. Carter took a step closer. The wood on the thicker branches had changed, no longer smooth and natural, but warped, swollen, like something inside the tree was forcing its way outward. At the tip of one branch, the bark split slightly, revealing a pale, smooth shape beneath. Not wood. Not quite. She reached toward it before her instinct screamed to pull her hand back. That night, they didn't tell the kids anything. They tucked them into bed, checked on them twice, left the hallway light on, and tried to pretend they were being silly. But around 1 a.m., the noise began again. Creak. Pause. Creak. As if something heavy was shifting its weight in the dark. She sat up. "That's not settling. That's not—" A soft thud echoed from the living room. Then another. She grabbed her husband's arm and they hurried down the hall, forcing themselves toward the sound. The living room lamp clicked on. The tree was leaning. Not by accident, not because it was falling. It was leaning forward, toward the hallway, toward the children's rooms. Several branches stretched unnaturally long now, at least a foot farther than they had earlier that evening. One of them nearly touched the doorway. "Jesus!" Mr. Carter whispered. He rushed forward and pushed the tree upright, bracing it with both hands. The needles trembled, as if reacting, as if irritated. He held it until the trunk stopped shifting, But when he stepped away, something brushed the back of his hand. A thin, curved branch moving back to its original angle with slow, deliberate grace. Mrs. Carter grabbed him. "We're getting rid of it tomorrow." He didn't argue. But as they turned to go back to bed, they heard it again. A whisper, barely audible, coming from the needles. "Lean, lean." And this time, the tree didn't sound like it was searching. It sounded like it was calling someone who might finally be able to hear it.
Morning brought a bright, ordinary sun that made the night feel distant and silly. Mr. Carter almost managed to convince himself he'd only imagined the tree leaning. Almost. When he walked into the living room, he stopped dead. The carpet in front of the tree was ruined. 3 long, parallel scratches dragged across the fibers, thin and shallow, but perfectly straight, as if something had been pulled slowly, deliberately toward the hallway. The marks started directly beneath the lowest branch and ended halfway into the entrance. Did the stand slide?" he muttered, checking the metal base. It hadn't moved an inch. The tree stood upright and innocent, lights off, ornaments still. Its branches were motionless, but lower than ever, some nearly grazing the floor. Mrs. Carter knelt to inspect the scratches. "This wasn't here yesterday. I vacuumed." From behind them, Beth's voice trembled. "It tried to come to my room." They both spun around. Beth stood in the doorway in her pajamas, hair mussed, clutching her stuffed bear so tightly its seams strained. Her eyes were red from crying. "What do you mean?" her mother asked, trying to keep her voice gentle. Beth lifted her wrist. On the soft inner skin of her forearm were 4 thin, reddish lines, not deep enough to bleed, but raised and raw, traveling in a gentle curve, as if a hand had wrapped almost all the way around, but not quite. "It tickled at first, like needles. I woke up, and something was brushing me." She swallowed hard. "It smelled like the tree, like dirt and cold and old water." Mr. Carter's jaw clenched. "Did you scratch yourself? On the headboard or something?" She shook her head, tears spilling over now. "I opened my eyes and saw it. That branch, the one with the weird bump." It pointed toward the living room. "It was in my doorway. It moved back when I sat up, like it was scared I saw it." Sam wandered in, rubbing his eyes. "It was saying it again last night, clearer this time. Liam or Leanne? I don't know, but it was louder." "Enough," Mr. Carter snapped, more sharply than he meant to. "We're taking it out today." He marched to the garage for tools, leaving his wife staring at the scratches on the carpet and the lines on their daughter's skin. When he came back with gloves and a handsaw, something made him pause in the doorway. The tree looked different again. One of the thicker branches had split into several thin offshoots, each jointed, each ending in a pale, rounded nub where bark had peeled back. They hung together, half-curled, suspended above the floor. They looked less like branches now, more like a hand hesitating in the dark, waiting to decide whether to reach again.
Mr. Carter didn't wait for the weekend. Right after dropping the kids at school and his wife at work, he steered the SUV toward the strip of road where they'd found the stand. The December sky was the color of dirty ice, and the radio's Christmas songs felt wrong in his ears. He shut them off halfway through the first chorus. The lot appeared ahead, a wide patch of cracked asphalt between an abandoned video store and a half-empty strip mall. Last week there had been a single floodlight glowing above the tree and the silent man standing under it. Today the floodlight was dark. The stand was gone. No wooden sawhorses, no string of extension cords, no hand-painted price sign. Nothing. Just wind skimming across the empty pavement, pushing a few fast food bags and dead leaves in lazy circles. Mr. Carter parked anyway, heart beating too fast for how cold it was. He walked to the exact spot where the tree had leaned against the post. There was no mark on the ground, no ring of crushed needles, not even a stray piece of twine. If he hadn't been there himself, he would have sworn it had all been a weird dream. Behind him, a door chime jingled. The small corner convenience store next to the lot had opened for the morning. He went inside, grateful for the fluorescent light and the smell of cheap coffee. A woman in her 50s stood behind the counter, scrolling her phone. "Morning." "Hey," he said, forcing his voice to sound casual. "Do you remember the Christmas tree stand out there? The guy selling from it?" She frowned. "What stand?" "Last week. Big spruce. Tall guy, old coat, right there by the floodlight." She shook her head slowly. "That lot's been empty all season. The city was supposed to rent it out, but no one bit. Floodlight burned out years ago." "That's impossible," he said before he could stop himself. She tilted her head. "You okay, hun? You look like you saw a ghost." He gave a weak laugh, muttered something about mixing up locations, and stumbled back outside. The wind cut through his jacket now, sharp and needling. He looked up at the floodlight. It was shoddered. Rust streaked down from the bracket. No wires connected to it. It couldn't have been on last week. It couldn't have lit anything. Driving home, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half convinced he'd see the man from the lot sitting in the back seat, cap shadowing his eyes. The house felt too quiet when he walked in. He set his keys down and forced himself into the living room. The tree greeted him like a guest who had settled in too comfortably. The branches were thicker again, fuller. One now rested openly on the edge of the couch, curled around the cushion as if testing how to grip. On the hardwood, just beyond the carpet's edge, faint muddy smears tracked in a short arc, then stopped. They weren't human prints. They were too long, too narrow, as if something with many thin, patient fingers had braced itself and pulled. By that evening, the Carters had stopped pretending this was just a weird tree. "We're getting rid of it tomorrow," Mr. Carter repeated for the third time as they finished dinner. "I'll drag it to the curb first thing." Beth kept her eyes on her plate. "What if it doesn't want to go?" "Trees don't want anything," he said, too quickly. Sam cleared his throat. "Then how come it knows a name?" No one answered. Later, while the kids brushed their teeth, Mrs. Carter went to the hall closet and pulled out the old baby monitor and a small motion sensor camera they'd used when the house had been broken into years ago. "What are you doing?" her husband asked. "Proving to you that we're not crazy," she said. "Or proving that we are. Either way, I want it on video." They set the camera across the room on the mantel, aimed straight at the tree. The tiny red light winked on, watching. The monitor stayed in their bedroom, its tiny screen washed in grainy grayscale. That night, no one slept much. The kids insisted on sleeping together in Sam's room. Mrs. Carter lay staring at the ceiling, the soft hiss of the monitor filling the darkness. At 1:12 a.m., the house creaked. At 1:13, something thudded softly. At 1:14, the monitor clicked. Motion detected. On the little screen, the living room came into sharper focus. The tree stood in the center, still and heavy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lowest branches shifted, not from side to side like they'd been bumped, but outward, stretching, extending, the wood elongating in slow, sickening inches. Needles bristled and then smoothed back as the branches slid along the carpet, pressing it down in thin, straight tracks. Mrs. Carter's hand shot out and grabbed her husband's arm. "Are you seeing this?" He didn't answer. On the screen, one of the thicker branches bent at 2 points at once, forming a crude elbow and wrist. The pale nubs at the ends flexed, opening and closing. Fingers. They were fingers now. The branch hand pushed against the floor, testing weight, and then began to drag itself forward. Another followed. The whole tree lurched, an awful dragging shuffle as it pulled its massive trunk an inch closer to the hallway. The monitor's mic picked up a sound then, not the creak of settling wood, but something wetter, like roots tearing free from too tight soil. And over it, faint and breathy, "Come, Liam, come, Liam." The branch hand reached the doorway, groping blindly along the frame, and then stopped, as if listening. Down the hall, Sam's door was closed. Beth's door, just across from it, was slightly ajar. The tree turned toward it. Not its trunk, its branches. All at once, the upper limbs angled in the same direction, like a crowd turning its head. Mr. Carter was already out of bed, running. Mrs. Carter tore after him, the monitor falling sideways onto the blankets, still showing the living room. By the time they hit the hallway light, the branch hand was already there, just inches inside Beth's room, fingertips grazing the edge of her blanket. The needles rustled as it recoiled from the sudden brightness, curling back on itself like a wounded animal. Beth shot upright with a scream. Behind them, in the living room, the tree shuddered all the way to its top, branches twitching like something that had almost gotten what it wanted, and had been interrupted.
The next morning, nobody fought about screen time or cereal brands. The house felt hollow, like sound was afraid to stay inside too long. The tree stood in the living room, looming and patient, its branch hand curled close to the trunk as if pretending innocence. Mr. Carter spent half an hour in the garage, staring at tools he didn't quite dare use. Mrs. Carter finally snapped. "We're not the first people on this street to have lived here," she said. "Somebody knows something." They bundled the kids into jackets and stepped out into the brittle cold. Across the street, in the peeling blue house with the sagging porch, old Mrs. Green sat in her usual spot, wrapped in a crocheted blanket, a mug steaming in her hands. She watched the neighborhood the way small-town libraries watched kids who whispered too loud. "Morning," she called, voice thin but sharp. "You all look like you saw the devil." Mrs. Carter forced a smile and crossed the street. "Have you ever heard of anyone selling trees over by the strip mall? Just one man, one big tree, late at night?" Mrs. Green's face changed. The warmth drained out of it, leaving something wary. "Where'd you get your spruce?" she asked instead. "Roadside stand, by the old video store. Man in a coat?" "No, you didn't," Mrs. Green cut in, "'cause nothing sells there, not anymore." The kids shifted closer. "Our tree moves," Sam blurted. It says a name. Liam, or something." Beth hugged herself. "It tried to hug me." The old woman's eyes flicked to the Carters' front window, where a shadow of branches pressed faintly against the glass. "There used to be woods where that strip mall is now, before the lot, before the stores, back when my boys were small. Kids played there, built forts, got lost. One winter, a little boy disappeared. Name was Liam. New family in town, poor folks. Boy went sledding with the other kids, didn't come home. They found his sled by a big spruce. Never found him. Snow came in hard that week. Cops said maybe he wandered, maybe a creek. Parents never believed it." Mrs. Carter swallowed. They think he died there?" "They cut the woods down a few years later, paved everything, built that mall. But when they cleared the big spruce," Mrs. Green's hand trembled around her mug, "they said its roots were wrong, twisted around something, around someone. County hushed it up. Small towns do that. Folks started saying you don't build over a grave and expect it to stay quiet." Sam's voice was barely a whisper. "What happened to the family?" "Packed up and left after the thaw. Mama never stopped calling his name, though. You could hear her sometimes at night, out by the tree line. 'Liam, baby, come home.'" She paused. "Funny thing." "What?" Mrs. Carter asked, although she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "Couple years back, some people swore they saw a man selling trees from that lot. One tree only, cheap as dirt. Never talked much. Folks who bought from him, well, they said the same thing you just did. Whispers, branches reaching, calling a name that ain't theirs." "And then?" Mr. Carter forced out. "Then they got rid of it. Or they thought they did. But you can't just throw away something that grew roots in grief." She leaned forward. "Tell me you didn't bring that thing into your kids' rooms."
That night, the Carters pushed a heavy bookcase against the living room doorway. It wasn't much, but it made them feel like they'd drawn a boundary the tree couldn't cross. They dragged the kids' mattresses into the parents' bedroom, huddling together in the dim glow of a nightlight shaped like a snowman. But the house still felt awake, restless. Near midnight, the first sound came, a slow scraping, like something testing the floorboards with new weight. Mrs. Carter sat up immediately, heart hammering. "Stay here," she whispered, though the kids were already clutching her arms. Mr. Carter approached the hallway with a flashlight, stepping as quietly as possible. The beam shook in his hand as he reached the end of the hall and angled it downward. The bookcase was shifting, not falling, being moved, inch by inch, dragged along the hardwood by something pushing from the other side. He braced his hands against it, shoving back with all his weight. The bookcase stopped moving for a moment. Then came the whisper. Not faint this time, not shy, right against the wood. "Liam." The branches rustled on the other side, scraping upward, slowly feeling along the edges, sliding into narrow gaps. Then something thin pierced through the space between frame and shelf, one pale, jointed branch tip, wriggling like a fingertip testing a crack of light. Another followed, then another. Mrs. Carter appeared behind him, holding a broom like a spear. "Push," she hissed. Together, they forced the bookcase back into place, slamming it hard enough that the branch tips snapped backward with a soft, splintery hiss. And then A new sound. From the living room, muffled but unmistakable. The entire tree shifting its weight, dragging itself backward, as if preparing for another try. But not now, not yet, because somewhere inside that mass of needles came a new whisper, one that chilled them in a different way. Not her, not her. Where my boy?
By morning, the house felt heavier, like the quiet itself had gained weight overnight. The bookcase, though still wedged in the doorway, had shifted a full inch despite their combined force. The kids stayed in the bedroom, refusing to step into the hallway without both parents. Mr. Carter finally gathered the courage to check the living room. He pushed the bookcase aside carefully, broom in one hand, the other gripping the doorknob like he was expecting it to bite. When the door swung open, he froze. The tree had moved. Not dramatically, no toppled furniture, no smashed ornaments, but the entire trunk now leaned toward the hallway, angled like a frozen stride mid-motion. Needles carpeted the floor beneath it, but not fallen naturally. They fanned outward in long, straight lines, like something had dragged itself across them and swept them aside. Mrs. Carter stepped in beside him, eyes scanning the room. "Do you smell that?" It wasn't pine anymore. It was soil. Damp, freshly turned soil. Forest floor earth, the kind that clings to fingers after digging. She followed the scent to the wall behind the tree. There, poking between two floorboards, thin, hair-like roots wriggled softly, retreating the moment the flashlight hit them. She gasped and stepped back. "There, it's growing! Inside the house!" As she spoke, a faint cracking sound whispered through the wall like something splitting wood in slow, careful breaths. Crack, creak, crack. Mr. Carter leaned closer and saw it, a bulge forming beneath the wallpaper, spreading like a bruise. The pattern warped, then tore slightly as something pushed outward, thin, pale strands forcing their way through. Roots. Alive. Searching. Mrs. Carter covered her mouth. "It's trying to spread. It's trying to anchor itself." Behind them, Sam's voice drifted from the hallway. "Mom?" They spun around. Sam stood a few feet back, trembling, holding something in his hand. A small wooden figure, carved crudely, weathered, the edges soft with age, the shape unmistakable, a little boy in winter clothes holding a tiny sled. "Where did you get that?" Mrs. Carter rasped. Sam swallowed. "It was under my bed." And from the living room behind them, the tree rustled in one long exhale, a sound almost relieved, almost grateful, as if it had finally found a trace of what it had been searching for. For a long moment, no one moved. Sam stood there clutching the little wooden figure, shaking so hard the carved sled clicked softly against his knuckles. Mrs. Carter knelt and gently took it from him. The figure was cold, colder than the house, colder than winter air, like it had been buried in deep soil and pulled up too soon. Behind them, the tree gave a low, creaking groan, not threatening, not hunting. Mourning. Mr. Carter stepped between his family in the living room. "That's it! We're taking this thing out of the house now!" But when he moved toward the tree, the branches didn't reach for him. They lowered, almost submissively. The dozens of thin root tips poking from the wall slowed their writhing and drooped like wilted veins.
Mrs. Carter stared at the wooden figure. "It's not trying to hurt anyone," she whispered. "It's looking for the boy, for Liam. It thinks he's here." Sam's voice trembled. "But why my room?" Mrs. Carter touched his cheek. "Because you're about his age, because you heard his name." They all turned toward the tree, and the tree, for the first time, went completely still. A single branch extended, slow as breath, and pointed toward the front door. It wasn't reaching for the children. It was telling them something. "Outside," Mrs. Carter murmured. "It wants us to go outside." They bundled up the kids and stepped onto the porch, leaving the door open. The tree remained inside, towering in the living room like a silent witness. The wind cut across the yard, and somewhere distant a siren wailed. Mr. Carter scanned the street. "What are we even looking for?" Just then, the wooden figure in Mrs. Carter's hand warmed. Then it tugged, not with force, just a tiny pull guiding her hand toward the old maple tree near the edge of the yard. The snow there was shallower, disturbed by something long ago forgotten. She knelt and brushed away the frost and felt her fingers sink into earth unnaturally soft for winter. Loose soil, turned soil. She dug deeper, and then she found it, a scrap of red fabric, frozen stiff, the edge embroidered with tiny faded letters, L-I-A-M. The wind fell silent. Inside the house, the Christmas tree trembled. Its branches lifted not in hunger, but in recognition, a shudder of grief that had waited decades. Mrs. Carter lifted the scrap gently toward the open doorway. The tree leaned forward, every branch bowed. The whisper came again, but now it was soft, aching, almost peaceful. "My boy." The lights on the tree flickered once. Then, all at once, every branch sagged. The roots writhing in the walls stopped moving. The mass of green loosened, shedding needles like tears. The trunk collapsed inward, folding, shrinking, drying, losing its unnatural shape. Within minutes, the towering spruce was nothing more than a brittle, lifeless heap on the carpet. A dead tree that had finally let go. The Carters stood in the doorway, breath fogging in the cold, watching the last of the branches crumble into stillness. Behind them, Sam whispered, "Is it gone?" Mrs. Carter wrapped him in her arms. "Yes, sweetheart, it found what it needed." But across the street, old Mrs. Green watched from her porch. And she wasn't smiling, because in the woods behind the strip mall, the place where the big spruce once grew, a new sapling had pushed up through the frozen earth, small, thin, already branching, and its tiny shadow stretched farther than it should have.